I left off. So I just said that if you want to anchor the boat, on a calm day you can get away with twice the depth of water of chain and warp, and it'll hold under those circumstances. The windier it becomes, the more you need to put out, and on a rough day you might need 4 or 5 times the length of warp out. And the acid test is the anchor holding and is the boat dragging or not? And if it is, you're simply going to put out more warp, and that will allow the boat to get farther away from the anchor, lower the angle of pull to the anchor, put more chain on the seabed, and give the anchoring chain a better possibility of digging in and actually holding the boat. And the chain is a really important part of the system because it does about 70% of the work. So a decent bit of chain is really, really important. There's our kill cord picture again. And our fellow here, as I said, has got it around his wrist. Not the best of places for it. Around his leg would be much better. And then he won't wrap it around the steering wheel. Clearly, the purpose of the kill cord is to stop the engine should the cocks fall overboard and prevent the boat from running away. Make certain you've got a spare so that you can go and collect him back. All dive boats should have a set of flares on board. I've got a selection of flares here that are used for a variety of different purposes. The first one in the list is a parachute rocket flare. That's a long-range flare that is good day or night. Has a nominal visibility in good visibility of about 32 nautical miles, and is exactly the sort of flare that you're going to use if you're well offshore and you've no sight of any other vessels around you that could offer you assistance. The second flare in the list, the one in the middle here, is a handheld red flare. They're a fairly dangerous bit of kit because they produce a hot red flame that comes out of the end of the flare. Metal body of the flare will be white hot, and there will be bits of molten metal dropping off of it. So quite clearly the only safe place for it is over the side of the boat. When it's expired, drop it into the sea. Handheld red flares like this are used to attract attention when you can see a rescuer. They have a limited visibility of 2 or 3 miles. They're good both night and day. The white capped flare, the next one that you can see here, is an anti-collision flare, and the intent of that is to set it off when a vessel is going to collide with you to warn it away. And then the canister flare we've got on the end here is a smoke flare, only good during the day. Clearly, if it's dark, it's difficult to see smoke. And this flare produces clouds and clouds of orange smoke, usually for 2 or 3 minutes. And it's a floating flare, so once you've set it off, you can cast it out on the surface of the sea, and it'll just float by the boat. There are a couple of extra flares at the bottom here that are diver-related flares. You can actually get waterproof flares that you can put in the pocket of your stab jacket and take diving with you, so that you can attract attention when you return to the surface if the boat is unable to. All dive boats should have some life jackets on board. Here, perhaps, we have a bit of a discrepancy in that most divers are wearing a dry suit, and perhaps they would suggest that that is a buoyancy aid that will keep them afloat if there is an issue. However, if you go over the side of the boat and you hit your head as you're going over and you're unconscious when you end up in the water, your dry suit does not guarantee to keep you face up. So it might well float you face down with the obvious consequences. So a proper inflatable life jacket, either an automatic one or a manually activated one, it puts all of the buoyancy on the front of your body and will guarantee to float you face up. You do tend to find it is only the coxswain of the diver that's got one of these on. Perhaps there's a case to say that everybody should be wearing them, but that's a local club decision, so to speak. You're for sure going to need a fire extinguisher. If you have any sort of fire on a rib, for example, Well, the boat is made of plastic. It's got rubber tubes. Both materials burn very, very well indeed. It's a floating fuel tank, because somewhere in the boat there will be a large fuel tank full of petrol. And there are some nice sources of ignition from the engine. So if you do have a fire, you're going to need to tackle it fairly quickly, and you're going to need a fire extinguisher on board in order to do so. Make certain it's not mounted by the engine, because if it's mounted by the engine, you may not be able to get to it. So it wants to be mounted up in the console area somewhere. You can get these rather nice little inlets that go in the back of the console or in the back of the seats, so that the fire extinguisher is mounted out of the way and is not in people's way. Okay, so that was some of the recommended safety equipment that was essential. There's some recommended stuff on the list here. Warps and fenders are useful for protecting the sides of the boat. Handheld VHF could be useful, and handheld VHFs these days are very good in that they often are completely waterproof and afloat. So if you end up in the water with one, you can still use it. Don't think an EPIRB is a useful piece of kit for your average club boat. An EPIRB is a distress beacon. It sends out a signal to a satellite on 406 megahertz. It's really intended for craft that are travelling beyond the range of VHF radio communications. It's also a very expensive bit of kit, and they start probably price-wise £300 or £400 and go up from there. I certainly wouldn't recommend one for a dive boat, but if you're on a boat that's travelling farther afield, then it may be a useful bit of kit. Throw line to throw out to somebody to pull them into the boat. Handheld compass for position fixing. Sharp knife's really good idea. You get the rope around the prop. Then
I've rung them 12 times now. Well, I'm going to keep trying.
John Beattie, could you mute your mic, please? And then towing bridle, that's useful if you've got to tow another boat, as is a sea anchor to keep your boat head to sea. Okay. If you have an engine breakdown, clearly if the engine is broken down, the boat will turn beam onto the sea and will roll badly, and that would be uncomfortable. You've got a sea anchor. Even a bucket will do as a sea anchor that you can tie to a length of line. You deploy off the bow. That will keep the boat head to sea, and she'll go up and down in a much more comfortable manner. I've got Leon Smith asking me what is the difference between a warp and a fender. A warp is a length of rope that you use to tie the boat up with, Leon, and a fender is one of those inflatable devices that you put between the boat and the rough harbour wall or the pontoon to prevent damage. And most small boats will have both warps and fenders on board. Alternative propulsion. Well, I have a 7.8 metre rib craft that weighs 2.5 tons. Paddling it with a paddle is just not an alternative means of propulsion. You're completely wasting your time. And indeed, we don't even have paddles on board the boat. And if we did, the only use they would be for measuring the depth of water. So actually having an alternative means of propulsion in terms of a paddle is just not going to work. Now you could say, well, shall I put a small engine on the back of it? So I've got a little 4 horsepower engine as a donkey engine. So if the main engine breaks down, then I can use that. Well, in my experience, modern marine outboards are incredibly reliable, and invariably your little auxiliary engine that's attached to the back of the boat will sit there and never get used and will end up mouldering away on the transom. Then you've had the expense of buying it, the expense of servicing it, and putting fuel for it. Okay, so should we have 2 engines instead of 1 engine? Well, yes, we can. No issue with that at all. Then if one breaks down, we can use the other one to get back. But there are pros and cons to that as well. As a rule, you need about 10 horsepower for every 100 kilos of boat weight to make the boat go to its design capability. So if you've got a boat that weighs 2 tons, you need a 200 horsepower engine. So, okay, could we put 2 100 horsepower engines on it? And then if one of them breaks down, we've got one to get us home. Yes, we could. Not an issue with that at all. But we've got twice the cost of purchasing it, twice the cost of servicing it, and twice the cost of putting the fuel through it, because it will probably use exactly the same amount of fuel for the two of them as you would, or even more, for a single engine. And then if one of them breaks down, your single 100 horsepower engine will not make the boat plain. Therefore, you're only going to be able to limp home at slow speed. It will, of course, get you home. So perhaps you ought to go back to the auxiliary idea and just have a little one that you're going to use under those circumstances. There's another issue as well. 2 100 horsepower engines don't make a 200. Because of interference between the propellers, you lose about 20% of the output. So 20% of 200 is 40 horsepower. So actually, you've only ended up with about 160 horsepower on the back of the boat. So that's an issue as well. We did some calculations at Southampton Boat Show a couple of years ago. I demonstrate for Ribcraft at Southampton Boat Show every year. And we've always used Ribcraft ribs. And somebody asked the question, well, how often do these things break down? And we worked out that over a period of about 12 years and 3 different boats, I've had 2 breakdowns. Now, part of that is attributed to the fact that we're using our boats every day. Part of that is attributed to the fact that we regularly service them and carry out any work on them that's necessary as and when it occurs. So we're using the things, and they're much better used than left standing when everything comes up. And part of that is attributable to the fact that these modern outboards are incredibly reliable bits of kit. When we looked at the breakdowns that we had, we found that one of them was caused by a break in the wiring loom between the engine and the control box. And it was a bit embarrassing because when you turn the steering wheel to the left, the engine stopped. And then you turned it back to the right, it started again. Made it great fun getting it onto the trailer. Now, I don't think you could blame that breakdown on the engine. There was nothing on the engine. It was a wiring issue. And the second time, somebody snapped the key off when they were starting the engine in the lock. And we couldn't start the engine. There was nothing wrong with the engine, but we just couldn't start it. So in a period of 12 years, we've had 2 breakdowns, neither of which have been directly related to the engine itself. So they're reliable bits of kit. Emergency steering, well, you can buy an emergency steering arm. It bolts onto the front of the engine using the existing bolts that join the hydraulic steering to the engine. That allows you to stand at the back of the boat and steer the boat using that emergency steering arm. But of course, if you haven't got one of those, well, what can you do? Well, if you've got a paddle, one of the paddles that you're going to measure the depth of water with, and some gaffer tape or some very large cable ties, you could perhaps gaffer tape the paddle to the side of the engine, and that might allow you to steer the boat if you have no normal steering. Or if you're heavy-handed enough, you might be able to stand at the back of the boat and use the lid of the motor to steer the boat. I think I'd prefer to go with the emergency steering arm because it seems the simplest method. And do 2 bolts, put a metal tube on and put the 2 bolts back in. Okay, so that's some of the ancillary equipment that's required. Now, one of the things I've not talked about in any detail so far is VHF radio. And I'm going to cover that now under emergency communications. And I've got a couple of things I need to say about this. Most dive boats will have a VHF radio. These days, it will tend to have a digital selective pooling VHF radio. Typical range of a VHF radio, somebody type an answer for that, please, in the chat line. How far can a 25-watt fixed VHF radio on a small boat communicate with another boat? How far away can they communicate with another boat? Somebody give me an answer to that. What do you think? Okay, we've got no answers yet. So what is the range of a 25-watt radio for boat-to-boat communications? Any idea, anybody? You can unmute your mic and speak to me if you want. Leon Smith said, depends on the aerial, surely. Yes, indeed it does, Leon. And indeed, the higher the aerial that you have, the greater the range that you can communicate with. So sailing boats do much, much better than powerboats or ribs because the aerial is on top of the mast, some 16 meters high. John Rice seems to think it's 6 nautical miles. Any other offers, gentlemen? Ladies even? How far can we communicate with another?
60 nautical miles.
60 nautical miles. John says 15 nautical miles. Well, we've got a variety of different answers. It's a 25-watt radio. If you think a watt a mile, then your typical range is going to be 20 to 25 miles in line of sight. That means if there's a cliff in the way, you're not going to be able to talk to somebody beyond the cliff. Or if there's a large ship in front of you, that will blot it out as well. If you're a sailing boat, you might do a bit better. You might do 30 miles or a little more because of the height of your aerial. But generally speaking, if you think in terms of 15, 20, 25 miles, you're in the right sort of. Handheld radios only transmit and receive on 3 watts or 5 watts. Okay. Timothy Deacon, can you mute your mic, please?
Oh, sorry.
It's all right, no worries. Handheld radios only transmit on 3 watts or 5 watts, so 3 miles or 5 miles. So a much, much shorter range. Digital selective calling, however, the distress button, you can see it here, that sends out a digital distress message. Because it's a little blip of digital information, it doesn't require as much power to send it out as voice does. And typically, you're going to get a slightly greater range with DSC, of about 10% more. So if you were able to talk to somebody on voice at a range of 30 miles, DSC is going to go out around about 33 miles. And DSC is very useful in that at a touch of a button, and there is a particular way that you press the button on a European radio, not on an American Icon radio, only on European radios, and it's generic on all European radios. Press the button. That lets you into a menu so you can choose the nature of the distress, and then repress the button and hold it in for 5 seconds to send the information. And it will send your position taken from the GPS or from the radio itself. It will send the time you press the button. It will send the nature of distress if you've selected it from the menu. So it's sending out the critical information that you need in order to tell somebody that you have a problem, where you are, what the problem is, and who you are. It sends out your marine telephone, your MMSI number. So it identifies you, tells others what the problem is. Now, moving on from that, if you have a diving emergency, you're going to need to communicate with the Coast Guard and the rescue services. You can do it by DSC, as I've already said, or you can do it by voice. If you've got an unconscious diver, so unconscious or missing, and this is not a mandatory requirement, I would suggest that you need to put out a Mayday call. Now, this information comes from the Charter Skippers Association, who have an agreement with UK Coast Guard on how to deal with diving incidents. So unconscious or missing diver is a Mayday call. Can somebody type me up in the chat line the definition of a Mayday call, please? So what is the definition of a Mayday call? Risk to life. Okay, John Rice says risk to life. Is there anything else to it other than risk to life? Imminent risk of loss or life of the vessel. That's getting a little bit better. That's fine. Immediate danger. I'll accept that as well. Correct definition of a mayday call is grave and imminent danger to vessel or persons, requiring immediate assistance. Well, if you've got an unconscious diver who's not breathing, that's definitely a risk to life, and therefore definitely a mayday call. The question to ask yourself to decide if something is a mayday call is somebody's life at risk? Are they dying, or is the vessel sinking? And if the answer to either of those questions is yes, it's a mayday call. If the answer to either of those questions is no, it's not a mayday call. The other agreement between the Charter Skippers Association and the Coast Guard is for decompression incidents or missed stops. And for a decompression incident or missed stop, they want you to put out a Panpan call. Panpan, well, Mayday and Panpan are both French names. Pan comes from either broken, en panne is broken, or panique in the French language. Well, panique's quite good. If you've got some news, you've got decompression illness or missed stops, they're probably in a bit of a panic, so that fits in quite nicely. And the definition of a Panpan call, which is an urgency call, is a serious problem but not yet distress. So you have a serious problem, but it's not yet distress. And the question you ask yourself, because it's an urgency call, is this urgent? If it's not urgent, it's not a Panpan call. So it must be some other call. Kenneth Wright has asked about Panpan Medico. Panpan Medico is a term that was used and no longer exists to request from the Coast Guard medical advice of a doctor. UK Coast Guard have arrangements with two hospitals in the UK, Gosport General and Aberdeen Hospital, where they have paid doctors who they use to respond to medical emergencies on vessels to provide advice. If you want to talk to a doctor from your dive boat, you can. You simply need to put out a Panpan call, and as part of the Panpan call, ask the Coast Guard for medical advice from a doctor, and they will hook you up to one of the doctors in one of those hospitals. They'll be on a BT phone line, and they'll be talking to you on your VHF radio on the boat, and they are trained to use the BT phone line as if it was VHF radio, so they'll say over or out at the end of each conversation. And you can ask them whatever you like. Coast Guard are listening in on the call when it takes place, and if the doctor's saying, well, we need to get these people off, then they're already tasking the helicopter and getting it underway to go and collect your diver. Now, the information I've put up on the screen here is not set in tablets of stone. One man's disaster. One man's disaster is often another man's inconvenience. It's your call on the day as to the type of call that you put out. And being blunt about it, if you put out a call and you get it wrong, are the Coast Guard not going to help you? Well, of course they're going to help you. The fact that you've got the call wrong is a little bit irrelevant. It's probably more important to ensure that you make a call and that you make it immediately you have a problem than the call that you actually put out. But it's a very difficult decision sometimes to say, well, I'm going to call the Coast Guard because I've got a serious incident. But people are quite reluctant to do that. Indeed, the British Coast Guard have two complaints of people that go out on the sea. The first complaint is people don't tell them they're out on the sea. And, as their job is to look after our safety at sea, well, they can't do that if they don't know we're out there. And particularly with divers, if you're going out to dive a site, you really do ought to be talking to the Coast Guard and giving them your dive plans for the day, and then they've got a heads up should anything go wrong. And the other complaint that they make of people that are out on the sea is that they try and cope with the problem themselves and don't call the Coast Guard until it gets out of hand. So to put that into boating terms, the Coast Guard want to know when you've got a leak and there's a bit of water coming into the bottom of the boat. They don't want you to leave it until you're up to your neck in water, because that's too late to get the rescue services there. We're in Portland. I'm doing this webinar from Portland at the moment. I attended a diving incident last year in Portland Harbour on the wreck of the Countess of Erne. Many of you will know that. It's a very popular wreck in this particular area. I was with one of my boats over at Castle Cove on the opposite side of Portland Harbour. We were actually diving on some moorings for the sailing club, and a dive boat diving on the Countess of Erne put out a distress call. And what they said was that they deployed their divers in the water and the engine failed, and they'd been thrown onto the rocks by the Countess of Erne and managed to push themselves off of the rocks and get around the corner into the main entrance to the harbour where they deployed the anchor, but they were no longer able to see the site, so they couldn't see when their divers returned to the surface, and they couldn't provide any cover. I responded, and at the same time as my response, the Coast Guard called out the Weymouth lifeboat. And it's not very far from Weymouth to the East Ship Channel of Portland Harbour, probably only about 3 miles at most, so it's fairly close. I could see the dive boat from where I was at Castle Cove, and I just got out of the water. So I called the Coast Guard up and said, look, I can see the dive boat, would they like me to assist? And they said, yes, please. It took us 2 or 3 minutes to get to site. By the time we arrived at site, the divers had surfaced and were hanging on the buoy on the top of the wreck and looking to see where their boat was. So I called the Coast Guard and said that what I would do is pick the divers up and the lifeboat could take care of the rib that had drifted around the corner. It was very windy on the day, and the wind was blowing against the breakwater wall, and I found that I had to get divers to swim out individually and pick them up one at a time, and there were 6 divers. So I get one to swim out, I go around in a circle, pick that one up, and then repeat it to get the other ones. And it took me about 40 minutes to pick these 6 divers up because of the conditions. Well, during that 40 minutes, the lifeboat had still not arrived. And I was halfway back across the harbour, and the rib from the local marina had arrived on site and taken the dive boat in tow before the lifeboat arrived. So quite clearly, the rescue services will take some time to get to any distress situation or urgency situation that you may have, and you need to take that into account by calling them early. Do not leave it until the very last thing. The moment you have a problem, give the Coast Guard a heads up. You can always stand them down, not an issue with that at all. And if the problem develops, then they already have a heads up, and they've probably got people on the way to you to help you with that. This is not setting tablets of stone. It's your call on the day. If you get it wrong, it's not a disaster. Somebody is asking about the casualty being head up on the slope. It is a stock photograph, but it did come from the BSAC. So I can't make any comment about that. Okay, moving on then. Engine breakdowns. Well, is an engine breakdown a distress call? Could be. Depends where it occurs. If your engine breaks down and you're 20 or 30 metres off the rocks and you're unable to anchor, then I would suggest that it's a very urgent situation. It's not going to be a distress situation until you actually collide with the rocks, but it's certainly a very urgent situation and you need assistance now. However, if you break down 20 miles offshore and the boat is still happily floating and there are no issues with that at all, and it's a calm sunny afternoon and everybody's happy on the boat, all that really has happened is that the engine stopped. That's definitely not a distress situation. There is no grave and imminent danger to anybody. All that's happened is the engine is stopped. And you can bob around out there quite happily for an extended period of time while somebody comes and helps you. Is it a Panpan call? Well, I don't think it's a Panpan call either, because it's not urgent. It may become urgent as you drift towards the rocks at the end of Portland Bill, and it may become distress when you strike them. But at this moment in time, it's not urgent. So what sort of call is it then? Well, we've only got two other choices: a security call. Can anybody tell me what a security call is? Type your answer in the question area, please. What is a security call? They've not got any answers yet. What's a security call? Let's ask the question again. Hazard warnings. Thank you, James. A security call is a safety message broadcast by the Coast Guard at 3-hourly intervals to warn you of navigational warnings, the weather, any other hazards to boating, live firing, that sort of thing. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for those that have answered that question. Now, clearly, the picture on the right of our vessel that's sinking, well, that must be distress because, you know, the vessel's disappearing under the surface of the sea. Our breakdown could be as little as a simple routine traffic call to the Coast Guard to say, we're out here, we're broken down, this is where we are. And the Coast Guard are then going to say, well, do you need any assistance? And clearly you're going to say yes under those circumstances. So the Coast Guard are then going to try and find somebody to give her a tow by putting out an all-ships transmission. If they're not able to do that, they'll eventually send the lifeboat to tow you in. Fortunately, in the UK, there is no charge. If you break down off the French coast, you'll get a hefty bill that you'll need to pay with your credit card from the French rescue services. So probably a good idea to stay in the UK. Moving on, we've got a bit of IRPCS stuff here. That's international regulations for the prevention of collisions at sea, IRPCS. And these are the lights that small vessels are required to show. Now, seeing anything out in the dark can be incredibly confusing. A bright light may appear to be very close to you because it is bright, but it could be a great distance away. A dim light may be a long distance away, but appear to be close to you. So things become confusing. Allied with that, you get background lighting from the shore. Vessels present different attitudes to you, so you see them from different angles, and the whole thing becomes really quite difficult. Distance becomes difficult to measure in the dark. I frequently will ask one of my students to look out the window at a target that I've picked up on the radar and estimate for me how far away it is. And they'll frequently come back and say, well, it's 200 or 300 meters away, when actually the radar is telling me it's 5 or 6 miles away. So you lose all perspective in the dark. My most famous mistake was mistaking a dust cart for a Spanish fishing boat off of one of the Spanish ports, because that's exactly what it looked like. So night lights are incredibly confusing. If you look at picture 4 in the bottom left-hand corner, that is a small boat of less than 7 meters and does less than 7 knots, and that is only required to carry a single all-round white light. It doesn't even have to be attached to the boat. It can be just a torch. So a small boat like this might just have a single white light. Well, that could easily be confused with the stern light of a much larger vessel. And that larger vessel could be anything up to supertanker size. So that's confusing straight away. Standard light configurations, port and starboard lights, and a masthead light. And the port and starboard lights may be displayed on a mast. They may be displayed at the bow of the boat. If they're on a mast, the only requirement is that masthead light is more than a metre above the port and starboard lights. And this is a boat of less than 7 metres, but can attain more than 7 knots. So that's probably our dive club rib, where the lights are likely to be mounted upon the A-frame at the back of the The same configuration can apply to a vessel between 7 and 12 metres. But here we have the opportunity of splitting the masthead light and the stern light into two. Don't have to do it. It can show exactly the same configuration of lights as the smaller vessel, all round white on the masthead and port and starboard. So immediately it's difficult to tell whether we're looking at something that's less than 7 metres long or more than 7 metres long. And then in the last picture, this picture here, which is a vessel of 12 to 20 metres, it's a mandatory requirement that the stern light is a separate entity. But it's still going to look much the same as the other two in the dark, so it can be quite confusing. The next break point comes at 50 metres, where we have to have an additional white light at the bow, and that white light at the bow must be lower than the masthead light on the mast. So we'd have an additional white light here at the bow, lower than the masthead light. That would tell us that the vessel is greater than 50 metres in the level. I like that. Leon Smith tells me that West Bay Harbour Master has been threatening to levy a charge to come and tow you back if you've gone out patently ill-equipped. Well, I think that's very reasonable. If you've gone out patently ill-equipped, you should not have gone out on the sea in the first place. And there are far too many people that go and buy a boat off of eBay and just take it to sea with no training, no safety equipment, no life jackets or anything else, and then want somebody to go and rescue them. And I think that's a pretty reasonable thing to do. Similarly, so Leon is saying, are you saying that 1 metre vertical spacing in the pick doesn't apply to ribs with an A-frame but no mast? It does apply to ribs with an A-frame. Your port and starboard side lights have to have a minimum of 1 metre spacing between them and the all-round white. And that's why you see some ribs with the all-round white on a little mast sticking up from the top of the A-frame to achieve that 1 metre spacing. Quite difficult on a rib because the A-frame is not a high device in the first place. But there is a requirement for 1 metre spacing. In picture 3, John says, can the port and starboard lights be split, one on each side of the A-frame? In picture 3, they can indeed be split, one on each side of the A-frame. No issue with that at all. And that's the normal scenario you would have with a rib. That's absolutely fine. You could, of course, also have them on the bow and one either side of the bow. Or if you had a small cabin, as in picture 2, you could have them on either side of the cabin. There's no mandatory requirement as far as that's concerned, as long as you have them. Okay, so that's a little bit about lights. Again, I'll say that they are very, very confusing in the dark, and you need to go out and experience them, and then you'll understand the problems that are associated. Still with rules of the road. Still with rules of the road. Some basic collision avoidance situations. Boats meeting head-on are both required to turn to starboard and pass port to port. That's absolutely fine, nothing wrong with that at all. If you're overtaking another vessel, then you are what's called the give-way vessel, and the vessel you're overtaking is called the stand-on vessel. And as the give-way vessel, we can overtake on either side, but what we must not do is obstruct the vessel that we are overtaking. We need to keep well clear of it so that our weight doesn't throw it around and that we don't get in its way and prevent it steering a straight and steady course. And the stand-on vessel just needs to keep going on a straight or steady course in the direction which it's travelling. If we've got a crossing situation, again we have what's called a stand-on vessel and a give-way vessel. Now here's another question. Is there any right-of-way on the sea? Would somebody like to answer that question for me in the chat line? Is there any right-of-way on the sea? Mickey McCarthy is saying sailboats. I'm sorry, Mickey, not so. We've got Sebastian Daniel saying and anchors. Again, not necessarily so. There is no right of way on the sea. And in this third picture here, there is a stand-on vessel and a give-way vessel. Now, how does that work? Well, the stand-on vessel is permitted to stand on when the give-way vessel gives way. And should the give-way vessel decide not to give way and continue on a collision course that will make it collide with the stand-on vessel, then the stand-on vessel clearly has to take evading action to avoid that collision. So there is no right of way on the sea. There is a pecking order. The pecking order has always been power gives way to sail, sail gives way to a rowing boat, and so on and so forth. But essentially, the way of looking at it is that you give way to vessels that are less maneuverable than yourself. So a sailing boat would have to give way to a trawler who was towing a trawl. A sailing boat would have to give way to a vessel that was constrained by its draft. That means that it's in a channel, and because of its draft in relation to the channel, it's unable to leave the channel without being aground. A sailing vessel would have to give way to a vessel that was limited in its ability to maneuver. So, okay. Leon Smith is saying no, but convention says that motorboats give way to sail. Not always true, Leon. If I'm in my motorboat and I'm coming out of a harbour and I'm surrounded by a mass of little sailing boats that are all getting in my way, that cause me to have to stop, and by stopping I'm drifting onto the breakwater wall, what am I going to do? Am I going to allow my boat to drift onto the wall and get damaged? Or am I going to honk my horn and try and make the sailing boats move out the way and drive on? Well, I'm going to do the second of those things, aren't I? So, yes, the pecking order says that power gives way to sail, but that's not always the case. A sailing boat has to give way to something that is less manoeuvrable than itself. And many of these little sailing boats are very manoeuvrable indeed. So if you are towing something, you're constrained by your draft, you're limited in your ability to manoeuvre because of the work that you're carrying out, a sailing boat must give way to you. There will be other circumstances where that applies. Now, if we go back to this third set of pictures here, we have one vessel approaching the port side of the second vessel. And there are a couple of ways of deciding who has right of way, who is the stand-on vessel and who is the give-way vessel. We have navigation lights, port and starboard lights on both of the vessels. So here's a red light on the left-hand side of the stand-on vessel, and here's its green light. Okay, it's going to end again. That's no good. If you can see a red light, that's a traffic light. Red stop, green go. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Nothing wrong with that at all. Red stop, green go. Or you give way to the right. Well, when we drive on the roads and we drive off a roundabout, we give way to vessels coming in on the right. It's the same with the boat. So there's a couple of ways of we'll get rid of that. Now, there are a few sundries before we finish. For information on knots, refer to the BSAC film library. There's a good film, apparently, on knots that show you how to tie them. And for buoyage, Mark Paisley did a very good presentation on the IALA buoyage system. That's available on the catch-up film, again, from the BSAC. So, that was the Diver Coxswain revision. And the idea was that by the end of the session, you'd have a better understanding of the following things. Bit of voyage planning, work out where you're going to go to, decide when you need to be there. That might be slack water, it might be if you're doing a drift dive, that the tide is drifting in the right direction. Measure the distance to the site, work out how long it's going to take you to get to that site. Therefore, you can then work back from the slack water time and come up with a leave time. Tell your drivers what time you're going to leave, so that's fine. Boat safety equipment, well, there's a whole host of boat safety equipment. I've covered one or two things that are on there, anchors, keel ports, and the like. Dealing with emergency situations, Mayday calls, grave and imminent danger requiring immediate assistance for a Mayday call, and a Panpan call. A serious situation, but not yet distress. And a Panpan call is an urgency call. Question for a distress call: is somebody dying? Is the boat sinking? It's a distress call. Question for a Panpan call, an urgency call: is it urgent? It's not urgent. It's not an urgency. IRPCS, rules of the road. I've done a little bit on lights, a little bit on who gives way to who. And then there are these sundries at the end, lots of words that you can look up on the BSAC website. I'm about finished. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for your questions. John Rice says there's plenty of food for thought. Well, that's nice. Leon Smith said that's been excellent. Thanks. Leon Smith also says that's a handy way to remember who remembers who. And Bruce Jones said it was a great revision session. Well done. Need to drop. Don't know what he's doing about dropping. Have a great weekend, he says. And John Beatty says, thanks. That's excellent. I'm going to sign off now. So thank you very much all for attending. I'm sorry about the technical issues. We're going to try and sort those out for the next time. And I don't really know why we've had them at all.